Hello, thank you for calling Stanley Law & Associates. How may we assist you today? Hi, my name is Big Dan, and I'd like to file a lawsuit against a video game developer. Okay, maybe we can help you with that. What is their offense? Their offense is making a video game so goddamn good that it ruined my life. I can't work, I can't sleep, all I can think about is Persona 5 Royal. And in this video, we're going to do a deep dive critique on one of the most immersive RPGs I've played in years. What's up everyone, Big Dan here. I make videos about RPGs, and Persona 5 Royal basically consumed my life over the past month. I spent well over 100 hours playing this game, neglecting work, sleep, and conversations with my family to help bring you this review. So let me hit you with the TLDR before we dive into the critique. I absolutely fell in love with Persona 5 Royal. I haven't felt this immersed in an RPG or its characters since Baldur's Gate 3, which was only a few months ago, but you know what I'm saying. The combat, art style, the writing, almost everything about this game is S tier. And another thing I gotta mention, Persona 5 Royal is just dripping with style. The animations, art, music, and all just scream this game is cool as fuck. I'm talking hair slicked back, sunglasses on, cigarette hanging out the mouth cool. The soundtrack in particular is full of certified bangers. You might want to avoid listening to these hits out in public, or you risk breakdancing in the milk aisle at the grocery store. That being said, Persona 5 Royal has some problems. Namely, poor pacing, especially towards the end of the game, a handful of horrendously unbalanced combat encounters, I'm looking at you, Okumura, and just a general vibe of overstaying its welcome with a runtime of over 100 hours just to complete the main story. In fact, while I loved Persona 5 Royal, I really can't recommend this game to anyone who doesn't have a lot of free time. I'm an unmarried, childless, full-time gaming YouTuber, so I have a lot more time to play video games than most people, and even I struggled to complete this game without sacrificing other areas of my life. So basically, NEETs and children are the primary demographic who should play P5 Royal. This video will contain spoilers in the story section, but I'll try and keep the other parts of the video relatively spoiler-free. But without further ado, let's buckle up, grab some iced coffee, and dive into the stylish world of Tokyo in Persona 5 Royal.
May I have some iced coffee? Coming right up.
The gameplay of Persona 5 Royal can be broken down into 4 broad categories: combat and dungeon diving, confidant hangouts, side activities, most of which tie into your social stats, and main story, which mostly involves long conversations. This game is very dialogue heavy, by the way. I swear, yapping makes up about 2/3 of the runtime by my rough back-of-the-napkin estimation. And all of these categories of gameplay are driven by the almighty calendar. Completing activities in the game passes time, so a big part of the gameplay is managing your time and choosing which activities you complete wisely to continue progressing your character as well as the plot. It shares a lot of similarities to Pathfinder Kingmaker in this respect. Major story beats will play out on specific days or date ranges, leaving the in-between periods open for exploration and side content. And honestly, I loved this. Managing my day was one of my favorite parts of the game. I looked forward to selecting confidants to hang out with, power grinding social stats, and juggling all these activities while still tackling the main story was oddly satisfying. I guess I should also mention that your main character and many of your companions are high school students at Shujin Academy. So your general day involves going to class, with 2 time slots in the afternoon and evening where you can pursue side activities, confidant hangouts, or the main quest. And we're going to dive into what all of these activities are, but first, let's talk about the combat. I used to hate turn-based combat games. I found them incredibly boring and tedious, but I finally started warming up to the genre after playing Baldur's Gate 3 last summer. And while Persona 5 Royal's particular flavor of turn-based combat lacks the depth of BG3, I found myself having a blast with the battles in this game. Now I know some P5 Royal fans are probably mauling just hearing the phrase lack of depth. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Persona 5's combat mechanics are shallow, But let's be real, this ain't no BG3. There's no strategy with battlefield positioning, all your characters stand in a straight line and take their turns, there are far less abilities and builds than your typical D&D experience, and there are far too many throwaway trash mob encounters. But let's dive into your arsenal of options in combat. Your main offensive options are basic melee attacks, gun attacks, and persona abilities, which are essentially magic. Gun ammo is limited and only replenishes after a fight is complete. You can also go on guard if an enemy is about to launch a massive attack, and there are a plethora of consumable items you can use to heal, buff, debuff, or deal direct damage to enemies. The real key to success in combat is uncovering and exploiting your enemy's elemental weaknesses. Whenever you use an ability that an enemy is weak to, it grants you an additional action. The general flow of combat in Persona 5 is all about extending your turn by chaining off of enemy weaknesses and getting as many consecutive attacks as possible without letting your opponent get a turn. On normal difficulty, even basic enemies can do a shit ton of damage, so you really want to do everything in your power to prevent them from taking a turn. When you unlock a follow-up attack, you can also do a baton pass, which switches to one of your other squad mates, buffing their damage as well as regenerating health and stamina at higher baton pass ranks. Baton passes are crucial for getting through some of the more difficult boss fights in the game, most notably the Okumura boss fight and the final boss, as the damage buffs are pretty much essential to surviving those fight mechanics. If you weakness break all enemies on the field, you'll trigger a negotiation. This is how you unlock new personas for Joker. And oh yeah, I forgot to mention, your main character, Joker, can swap between different personas mid-combat, and he's the only one with the ability to do this. But if you don't need the new persona, you can also negotiate for money or items, or just say fuck you and launch an all-out attack, which is basically a team ultimate, and wipe them out entirely. The other type of ultimate attack you can sometimes trigger are called Showtime attacks. These are special cooperative ultimates performed by two members of your squad. They have flashy cutscene animations and deal insane almighty damage to a single enemy, often with additional effects like inflicting status ailments or increasing damage dealt in the next turn. But in many cases, these will end the fight outright. I had an absolute blast learning the ins and outs of the combat system, and there are a number of engaging encounters that really put your strategic thinking and team composition to the test. I particularly enjoyed some of the big boss fights in the main story, which I'll touch on later in the video. My only real gripe is that there are a lot of throwaway fights in the big main story dungeons, particularly the seemingly never-ending Mementos dungeon that you will visit for side quests throughout the course of the game.
Involving yourself with others is an important foundation for your recovery. You've done well.
Pursuing Confidant storylines is the main source of side content in Persona 5 Royal. Throughout your journey, you will become friends with a variety of characters, some of whom become full-on squad mates helping you out in combat, while others are just NPCs or shop owners. As you spend more time with your confidants, select appropriate dialogue options, and give them gifts, you will rank up their relationship. So, what's the point of all this? Why would you want to level up your confidant relationships? For starters, you can unlock useful gameplay benefits such as crafting stamina replenishers, boosting XP and money rewards, and most notably, Kawakami's special massage. This last one is super important for progression. Typically, whenever you do a Palace Dungeon or Mementos Dungeon run, you will be unable to complete any evening activities outside the house since your character is too tired. But if you get a special massage from Kawakami, you can go out in the evening even after doing a dungeon run. This will allow you to stay on top of other confidant relationships and social stat leveling. And the other reason to pursue confidant relationships is you can experience compelling storylines, which represent some of the best content in the game. Or to put it in Mass Effect or Baldur's Gate terms, confidant relationships are essentially the loyalty missions of the game. I want to emphasize that the writing for most of these characters is phenomenal. Atlus did a great job building up these characters' backstories, motivations, and creating an emotional hook for the player. In fact, I almost like some of these confidants just as much as my favorite squad mates in Mass Effect or Baldur's Gate 3. Not exactly on the same level, but pretty close. Even for the cutscenes that lacked voice acting, I would sometimes find myself getting all teary-eyed owing to the expert writing and excellent choice of music. This game is just so goddamn immersive, bro. My favorite confidants in Persona 5 Royal were Makoto, the politician, the gun store owner, the doctor, and Sojiro. But a lot of the other characters were great as well. The only confidants I did not like were Morgana, Akechi, and the Twin Wardens. I'll dive more into my reasons for Akechi in the main story section, but the Twin Wardens were just annoying, and Morgana was extremely cringe. I usually like cats, but this one was just obnoxious and self-absorbed. He incessantly simps over An in the most cringy and annoying ways. He even abandons your party at one point in the story and almost gets you killed because he gets all up in his own feelings over not getting praised enough. And I also ended up resenting Morgana because at various points in the story, your activities will be restricted. And anytime this happens, it's always Morgana telling you not to go outside. So yeah, I just kind of built up some resentment towards the character overall. Outside of Confidants, there are a cornucopia of side activities you can pursue to boost your social stats, the latter of which are broken down into 5 categories: charm, knowledge, guts, proficiency, and kindness. Completing side activities will often boost one or more of these stats. Examples include the Big Bang Burger Eating Challenge, watching a movie, crafting infiltration tools, doing laundry, playing darts or billiards, fishing, going to the arcade, playing baseball, reading on the train, working a part-time job, and so many more. One of the funniest ones is the Maid Cafe, which is like a Denny's, except all the waitresses dress up like maids. If you order the most expensive item on the menu, the waitress always fucks it up, and at this point, you can either say it's fine, which boosts your kindness, or be like, make it again, bitch, which boosts your guts. I don't know, I just thought this whole thing was funny. Leveling your social stats is important for unlocking later stages of Confidant questlines, or even the first stage in some cases, like EY and Haifumi. Like many RPGs, Persona 5 Royal also has romance options, and I'm gonna be real, I found this part of the game a bit off-putting given the age of the characters. Persona 5 Royal's romance options are a bit of a catch-22 when it comes to age, because Joker, who is a high school student, has the ability to not only date fellow students, but some of the adults as well, including one of his teachers. Some of these characters even make offhanded comments like, "Ha, it would be illegal if you and I started dating, ha ha ha," and then you could just date them anyway. The catch-22 comes into play when you consider the age of the player. If you're an adult and you decide to have Joker romance one of the adult characters, then it's less weird for you. I mean, who doesn't want a hot goth GF? But the age gap in this case is inappropriate in-game for Joker and his adult girlfriend. But by the same logic, if you choose to date one of the characters that is age-appropriate for Joker, then isn't it a bit weird for the player? Since you're effectively vicariously dating someone who is underage. It's giving FBI open up vibes. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that everyone who plays this game and partakes in the romance story arcs is some kind of creep. From what I've seen, most of the romance dialogue scenes are pretty wholesome. It's not like there are sex scenes or anything like that, it's just characters saying I love you and shit like that. But let's be real here. We all know there are some people out there who essentially live out fantasies through video game romances. I mean, the whole term waifu is about people who think they're in romantic relationships with fictional characters. There are a few instances in this game where adult male characters will hit on high school girls like Anne and Kasumi, often aggressively so. And these characters are rightly villainized. The main villain of Chapter 1 is Kamoshida, a high school teacher who abuses and hits on some of the female students among other crimes. So the game seems to acknowledge that adults hitting on minors is bad. But then the game turns around and unironically sexualizes some of these same characters, and Takamaki in particular. Anne's persona outfit is a tight red leather catsuit. If this isn't Coomer baiting attire, then I don't know what is. Hell, one of Anne's gameplay abilities is called Sexy Technique, for Christ's sake. This girl is 16. Now, I know someone is typing a comment right now, well, actually, the age of consent in Japan is... Just stop. I don't care. It's weird, bro. Maybe this could be chalked up to cultural differences. I don't know how people in Japan view this kind of content, but I personally find it uncomfortable. When I originally announced I would be playing and reviewing Persona 5, one of my viewers left a comment telling me to beware the shipping wars in the fandom. And oh man, I have deliberately avoided looking up fan discussions about the romance in this game because I just know there's gonna be some freaks out there. Maybe I'm making too big of a deal out of this because romance in Persona 5 is completely optional, but to me this is a tarnish on an otherwise phenomenal game. I enjoy video game romance as much as the next guy, but if we're gonna have romance in an RPG, let's keep all the characters above the age of 18, please. The last section I want to touch on in this video is the main story. I'm not going to rehash the entire plot since I don't want this video to be 3 hours long, but I will hit the highlights, talk about my favorite parts, and touch on some of the pacing issues. Here's the Cliff Notes version of Persona 5 Royal's main story. Set in modern-day Tokyo, the game follows a high school student named Joker who gets wrongly accused of assault and put on probation. After getting transferred to Shujin Academy and taken into the care of a grumpy coffee shop owner, Joker encounters a strange app on his phone that awakens his persona, a physical manifestation of the inner self. These personas allow the user to wield incredible combat abilities. Over the course of the game, Joker joins forces with other troubled students who also awaken personas. Together, they become the Phantom Thieves, a vigilante group that delves into the metaverse, a supernatural realm reflecting distorted desires. Here they confront the palaces, twisted manifestations of corrupt adults' hearts, aiming to change their hearts and expose their wrongdoings in the real world. The structure of the plot revolves around these palaces. Each chapter has its own central villain, complete with their own palace in the metaverse. Joker and the Phantom Thieves then have to infiltrate the palace, locate and secure a route to their heart, which manifests in the form of a physical treasure. Then they send a calling card to the target in the real world before confronting them and stealing their treasure in the palace. This culminates in a big boss battle, and after the mission is complete, the villain experiences a change of heart in the real world and confesses their crimes to the public. Some villain examples include Kamoshida, a high school teacher who physically abuses male students and sexually harasses female ones, driving one of them to attempt self-deletion. Madarame, a famous painter who plagiarizes and steals creative ideas from his pupils, while also scamming wealthy art buyers by duplicating and reselling original copies of his most celebrated work, which was also stolen from another painter. Kaneshiro, a mob boss who entraps and extorts teenagers, and Okumura, a corrupt CEO who exploits his workers and pimps his own daughter in an arranged marriage to a scumbag in order to advance his political aspirations. Throughout the game, the Phantom Thieves target increasingly powerful and increasingly corrupt figures throughout Japanese society, growing their influence and public support along the way. And while these villains initially seem like self-contained stories, there is a thread that ties them all together, which becomes apparent later in the plot. The palaces are where the bulk of the game's combat takes place, and they're really fun to explore. Atlus really went all out with the level design, making each palace unique and specific to the villain they represent. My favorite level was Futaba's palace, which is styled on an ancient Egyptian tomb. The target was interesting too because, unlike the other palace rulers, she was not a villain, but instead an emotionally stunted and troubled teenager who blamed herself for her mother's death and became a complete hermit in the years that followed. She contacted the Phantom Thieves and requested they change her heart as a last-ditch effort to break out of her depression, pain, and isolation. And after doing so, Futaba becomes one of our most trusted confidants. The boss fights were my favorite part of each palace, and each one had its own unique mechanics that the player had to overcome. Madarame could create copies of himself that would buff him. Kaneshiro could hire additional goons and launch ultimate attacks from a gigantic metal robot. And Sai Nijima could apply different debuffs based on a roulette wheel roll. But while I enjoyed most of these fights, there was one fight in particular that had me absolutely tilted. And if you've played Persona 5 Royal before, you already know exactly which one I'm going to name. It's the Okumura boss fight, which is probably one of the most poorly balanced bullshit fights I've ever seen in a turn-based combat game. Where do I even start with this one? For starters, the fight is on a timer. You have 30 minutes to complete the fight, which seems like a long time until you realize there are like 7 or 8 different phases. Also, Okumura likes to talk shit throughout the fight, and the timer keeps rolling through his long stretches of dialogue. Second problem, Okumura spawns extremely tanky robots to fight his battles for him. You have to defeat all enemies of each wave in 2 turns or less. Otherwise, he will respawn a whole new wave of enemies. And this is easier said than done. Even if you manage to weakness break all the enemies on the field, you cannot perform all-out attacks during this phase, which significantly nerfs your DPS. This is presumably because Okumura counts as one of the enemies, even though you cannot target him directly during this phase. Third problem. Some of the later phase enemies can one-shot your entire party, causing you to wipe and waste a ton of time. The entire fight is a massive DPS check and represents a gigantic difficulty increase compared to all the other content up until this point. Hilariously, one of the recommended strategies for defeating Okumura is to put the game on the highest difficulty, since your damage output is increased in that game mode. Okumura is easily the most hated fight in the Persona 5 fandom, and after experiencing it for myself, I can see why. In between major palace story arcs, you'll have ample free time to pursue confidant relationships, side activities, and Mementos dungeon runs. Mementos is basically the place that represents the distorted desires of the entire populace, and it becomes home to minor villains who haven't quite become evil enough to manifest their own palace. Mementos is the main place you can level grind your characters, and while the content is technically optional, you'll really need those levels if you want to keep up in combat power in the late game. My favorite section of the game was definitely the summertime. You have a lot more freedom, flexibility, and time to pursue confidant relationships and side content, which is honestly my favorite content in the game. Once you get into the fall months, you start to get railroaded into completing the main story and start running out of time to rank up confidants and power level your social stats. As the Phantom Thieves grow in popularity and take out more powerful targets, they begin to draw the ire of state investigators who seek to prosecute the group on criminal charges. This is where Akechi and Sai Nijima, aka Makoto's older sister, come into play. I hated Akechi from the moment I saw this dude. His smug tone of voice and constant tiptoeing around the fact that he knows your group are a part of the Phantom Thieves was incredibly obnoxious. And I felt vindicated when this guy ended up betraying your group to the authorities and became one of the prime villains in the story. Akechi turned out to be a complete, unhinged psychopath killer with major daddy issues. And honestly, I started liking him more after this reveal. He was a lot more interesting as an unhinged lunatic, especially considering his masquerade as a hotshot detective was a complete farce. But the change is really best experienced through the shift in his voice acting.
My apologies. I truly was just passing by. I must be going. There's a briefing for tomorrow's recording that I have to attend. So, you're going to go have cake now?
We're not murderers!
So what? Masayoshi Shido is finally within my grasp! Once he reaches the apex of his power and acknowledges me, I'm going to whisper in his ear. I will tell him the truth of who I really am. And that's when I, an utter disgrace to the world, will rule over him. I will prevail!
Akechi put a plan in motion to discredit the Phantom Thieves publicly, pin the death of Okumura and other mental shutdown victims on them, lure Joker into a trap to get him arrested, and then execute Joker inside the police station. Luckily, Joker sussed out that Akechi was a traitor in advance and managed to come up with a plan to fake his own death and escape the police. But Akechi was not acting alone. He was working for a much more powerful figure, the aspiring populist politician Shido, who turns out to be the main villain of the story that ties everything together. Shido was also the man who framed Joker for assault during the very beginning of the game, which destroyed his reputation, gave him a criminal record, and sent him packing to Shujin Academy. So your final showdown with Shido has a personal element. On top of that, most of the other villains we tackled throughout the game were somehow connected to Shido's nefarious plans to take over Japan. And so it's up to the Phantom Thieves to launch their final operation with the goal of infiltrating Shido's palace, stealing his treasure and exposing his crimes to the world before he can get elected as Prime Minister. But after defeating Shido, the game does not end. No, we've got another 20 to 30 hours to go, and this is where Persona 5 really started to lose me. Shido was a unifying figure, tying all of the various plot elements together. The mental shutdowns, the earlier villains, Joker's criminal record, and the Phantom Thieves taking on more and more powerful opponents throughout the course of the game. But after Shido's defeat, the game tries to up the ante by having the thieves take on a quote-unquote god in the form of the Holy Grail in the depths of Mementos. This represents the twisted desires of the entire population, and while I see what they were going for, I really think this part of the game falls flat. Fighting a quote-unquote god felt way too over the top, disconnected, and depersonalized when compared to Shido. Also, the quality of the level design falls off in this final section. After the grandiosity of a gigantic cruise ship that was Shido's palace, the final Mementos dungeon was an incredibly underwhelming series of black hallways. And even after you've defeated this god, wiped out the metaverse, and changed the world back to normal, we're still not done yet, because Persona 5 Royal adds an additional chapter that continues into the new year and adds one more palace and villain to the game. And that villain turns out to be Maruki, the high school therapist. Like, come on, dude, really? Again, I really felt like this narrative section was a downgrade from what should have been the final arc with Shido. I guess if you essentially view the third semester content as DLC, then it's an easier pill to swallow. At this point, I was honestly really burnt out on Persona 5 and kinda just wanted this whole thing to be over. The only thing I really liked about the third semester is that I was able to finish off a few Confidant quest lines that I failed to complete before taking on the Holy Grail. Maruki's palace is the longest one in the game, and the devs really upped the ante with the puzzles, enemies, and level design, so I still had fun playing through this section. The final boss fight was grandiose and epic, but it had like 3 different phases, including one where you literally fist fight Maruki after already defeating him in his persona, and it just screamed, we don't know when to quit and wrap up the story. I think if the devs would have cut out like 20 hours of content from the narrative, Persona 5 would have been a better game. It's still a great game, but it runs on just a bit too long for its own good. So there you have it. I finally played Persona 5 Royal and got some exposure to the franchise just in time for the release of Persona 3 Reload in the first week of February. It was a phenomenal, immersive journey, only knocked down a couple of pegs by a bit too much story bloat. I'm really glad I played this game, but given the length and the lack of story choices, I doubt I'll ever do a full second playthrough. But I'm curious to know what you think of Persona 5 Royal. Let me know in the comments below. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to Big Dan Gaming for more RPG videos and reviews. Big shout out to all the channel members for supporting my content. Until next time, this has been Big Dan. I should go.